Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Barbarian and this is Victoria 3's Dev Diary number 45. Today we have elections and this is a very important one. It's a fairly short Dev Diary, don't get me wrong here. But if you think about the period from 1836 to 1936, then you will realize that many countries in this period either started with elections or some sort of electoral system, whether it was very restrictive or not, be that as it may, or they developed towards it. Obviously, sometimes you go into the other direction again, but where I'm coming from here is that this is in its core a system that will probably in most playthroughs accompany you, be that temporarily or permanently. And this makes it very, very important. It needs to be a system that is flexible, that works reliably, and that works in a way that is clear and lets you influence it, because ultimately, this is all about national gardening. If I don't have all of the information, or if it's too easy to influence things, if it's too difficult, or if it's impossible to know how to influence certain things, then you're looking at a situation where you can't do the gardening, right? Without knowing where the garden is, where it begins, where it ends, and what to do about it, you can't really plant any flowers. I looked through this Dev Diary, and I'm generally, this is my conclusion basically from the get-go here, quite positive, very positive indeed, about the actual mechanical nature of what we can see in this Dev Diary. I think it is a system that promises to be very flexible, a system that promises to be quite reliable. I think that cause and effect are something that you will be very likely to always identify in the system. And that's, again, very, very good news. But as I read it, as I was reading it, something irked me. I went back to Ricky, I went back to Victoria 2, I checked them out, I looked at them and I said to myself, I think I get it. I think I know why I am peeved about these systems, despite them being mechanically speaking superior. And the issue for me there is an issue of immersion. I will spend a lot of time, I think, today talking about where I'm coming from there. Because mechanically speaking, I think this Dev Diary is very, very clear. I don't think there's too much to discuss there, in a controversial fashion. But I looked at it and I can't help but feel this way. So I want to basically bring it to you, the trial judges, whatever, right? Make sure that you leave your opinion in the comments as well, because I would like to know whether you share my concerns or whether I'm basically coming out of nowhere and it doesn't play a role. That is, of course, always an option. So, with all that being said, let's just jump in and I'll explain what I mean when I say I am sort of missing the immersion aspect in this one. We'll be covering the various laws that enable and affect voting, as well as the progression of election campaigns and how they affect political power in your country. We will briefly be mentioning political parties in this Dev Diary, but they are not the focus of this week. More on that next time, so next week political parties. For now, I'll just say that political parties in Victoria 3 exist in democracies and are made up of alliances of interest groups. Let's please remember, as we go through this, that political parties were added because the community wanted them, and the community primarily, as I understand it, at least that was my opinion at the time. I'm still not sure, we will obviously see next week, but I'm still not sure whether political parties actually add anything mechanically speaking. I hope they found a way so that political parties aren't just eye candy, but primarily I think the concern about political parties was that interest groups do of course showcase the societal stakeholders that are active in politics, that influence things beyond, before, after, and without elections, right? Stakeholders and with that interest groups will always be there. But they're not tangible. They're not something that you look at and go, oh yeah, I vote for the industrialists, of course. I vote for John Paradox, the industrialist leader of Sweden. No, you go and vote for a party. That party might be affiliated with one or several interest groups, right? And to a certain degree, I think that interest groups can also not be split, but have influence within multiple parties, right? But yeah, no, the issue with parties, as I personally held it back then, and as I personally hold it today, again, not sure whether I speak for everybody here, was that parties add more immersion. Living in a democracy, looking at parties, much more immersive. You look at it, you immediately know what's happening. Please put a pin in this, but keep it in mind, because this is the same dynamic of immersion that I am missing in this very particular system, as great as I think it is mechanically speaking. Let's take a look at it. A country has elections if it has any of the distribution of power laws that enable voting. These laws are landed voting, wealth voting, census suffrage, and universal suffrage. Landed voting is for aristocrats, capitalists, clergymen, and officers hold essentially all voting power, gaining a huge bonus to the political strength they contribute to their interest groups. Wealth voting. There is a wealth threshold that determines a pop's eligibility to vote. Pops that can vote have more political strength. Census suffrage, the wealth threshold, is significantly lower than in wealth voting. Literate pops contribute much more political strength to their interest groups. And then universal suffrage, there is no wealth threshold for voting. Pop type and literacy do not grant additional political strength. Though, of course, a pop's wealth will continue to contribute to their political strength, and literacy will make pops more politically engaged. These 4 types of potential voting laws, distribution of power laws, are great. They basically capture a significant subtype or a significant amount of subcategories within themselves. Universal suffrage could be so many different things. It could be first past the post, proportional voting. It could be, you know, I hope you get where I'm coming from there. A lot can be done here, right? Landed voting, wealth voting, census suffrage. All of them make it very, very clear who benefits from it, why they benefit from it, and how you can influence who benefits from it, right? Who, for example, if you are more interested in having people that are rich, then obviously go for wealth voting, and then you influence who is rich. All these sort of things. And in their core, as I said, on a mechanical level, I think that this system is really, really good. Because it's not hyper-specific, it's not finicky at all, you know exactly what you get, you know what cause and effect are, and it just works. But the longer I looked at this, the more I do think that similar to interest groups meets political parties, these laws, as much as they will be successful, I think, in emulating these stakeholders, their influence on society with or without parliament, and beyond parliament, of course, as much as they are good at that, I think that they are too removed of a layer to let you be immersed without needing to spin up a million lines of headcanon. What do I mean? Let's take a quick look at a Victoria 2 system right here. This is the political screen for Victoria 2. You may have seen it, you may not have seen it, I don't know, but I don't want to explain all of the details here. What is important is, what you need to know is that politics in Victoria 2 were a very multifaceted system, a very, very complex system, and a very respectable system, quite frankly, but also a system that obfuscated basically everything. I think most people, and I actually looked it up on the Discord, whether people were talking about it, I believe firmly that most people that played Victoria 2 do not know how the upper house is consolidated, like how they are reformed each year, why they are reformed each year, what they do, what their influence over things are, and how you can change things, right? I think most people do not understand it, because that is what Victoria 2 is. You know, unless you look into the files, unless you read everything very carefully, make a diagram, and then maybe even Google it, you will miss some details. But what I think should be immediately clear when we look at this screen is that you have the upper house, which, by the way, determines how you select the upper house in Victoria 2. We have the vote franchise, which determines the normal voters' ideology right here, and then which party becomes the strongest and can actually govern in a meaningful way. Then the voting system, first past the post, Jefferson method, proportional representation, and those are all the ones that I care about. You also have political parties. I just want to introduce political parties. They are not the same as what Victoria 3 does at all. Political parties is a law category that cements the power of the existing party that already exists, right? The ruling party, basically the higher you are here, benefits more. Other parties have to be underground. Your ruling party is the only thing that exists. Then harassment, then gerrymandering, non-secret ballots, and secret ballots, right? These are the different layers of entrenching the ruling party. Ignore the political party bit. But the rest is very interesting, isn't it? Because what we have here is the upper house. This means this is the Senate of the United States of America. I took the screenshot just earlier, actually. And what is interesting here is that they offered you the ability to say upper house, 2 per state, meaning every state in your nation that is I think they have to be cores in Victoria too, right? I think they do. Anyway, but every state gains 2 representatives based on what the ideologies of that state are. And that's interesting, because when we talk about the American Civil War and when we talk about it in Victoria 3, I'm gonna go ahead and say I think Victoria 3 captures what the slavery debate was about in a very, very good fashion. I think that the societal debate around it is very, very interesting. And again, it goes much further beyond Congress, right? But there's a societal debate. Interest groups switch around, they change. It's very difficult to handle all of the pressure that the stakeholders assert on you, the spirit of the nation, and you might just fall apart. But what it misses is any aspect of the actual political, legal, electoral framework around this. What I mean is very simple. Before the Civil War broke out, you had decades of course, strife within the United States of America, because this was a contentious topic, and this was a topic that couldn't be settled very easily. There was a compromise that is present in Victoria 2, but I think was never explained in-game. You needed to know about it to actually employ it properly. But basically, if a state that would be a non-slavery state were to enter the Union, were to be admitted to it, another state would have to be admitted to the Union, and that state would have to be slavery. The reason for this is the 2 per state rule. The Senate gets 2 senators per state, right? Same case today. Same system. And as long as the amount of non-slave states is the same as the amount of slave states, what you will have is the ability to block any attempt by Congress to outlaw slavery. This was a core aspect of the defensive strategy of the South on a political, on a legislative level to withstand the pressure to give up slavery. In Victoria 3, you have this. You have this. But you don't have it literally. What I mean is, if you recall the American Civil War Dev Diary, you will recall that they were talking in particular about the topic of course, for example, you know what, let me actually just open the page here. Right, here we are. This is the American Civil War Dev Diary. When we talk about outlawing slavery in Victoria 3, we have this system where you can try to pass the law, other people will oppose it, it will cause strife, it will cause civil unrest, it will cause, of course, a movement that might become radical and then spark the Civil War. But fundamentally, you do not have the bicameral reality of the United States of America, how that was relevant for slavery and how that was relevant for outlawing slavery. You do not have this represented in any meaningful way in Victoria 3. When you look at this screen right here, debate 48.2% basically is the symbol. It symbolizes this proposal gets stuck in the Senate for all eternity. If you do go with success, if you get it, if the chance works, somehow you did it, right? But the actual theory, the theory behind the political structure, behind how you can get rid of the South's privileges in the Senate, for example, by only admitting a non-slavery state, none of that is emulated from what we know. And I think that mechanically speaking, Victoria 3 does it the right way. As I said, in Victoria 2, most players can likely not explain you how to actually navigate the screen. That you need the upper house, right? That you need to influence the upper house, and you can do this by the upper house setup right here, ruling party only, which is very, of course, beneficial if you have it. Appointed is based on, for example, your aristocrats and so on, then 2 per state, and then based on population with relative proportionality right there, right? Or well, with absolute, actually. It's just the population's distribution, I think. Most people won't know that. Most people won't know that then if you have an upper house that listens to you, that is on your side, that they can then actually actively pass whatever is on the agenda of the party that is in the upper house, or of the parties that are in the upper house, then you can change your voting system and so on and so forth. This screen is hell, primarily because it is too concrete. It is too, specific. You need to know exactly where the cogs all work together. This is not just bad UI, it also is actually something where it is much too precise, because it can happen that you can really exploit the game by, for example, going with appointed or by 2 per state, right? There are some exploit options in there. Not to mention, of course, that if you just declare a war and just let the war score tick against you, you can pass whatever reforms you want, because militancy plays into this as well. But that doesn't really matter. Where I'm coming from is that this system, mechanically speaking, is hell, but on an immersion level, puts you right down where you were. That is the United States of America in 1836, right here. Admitting a new state, making them slavery or non-slavery, actually plays a role in this system. In Victoria 3, you can roleplay that it does. Right? What I mean is you can roleplay, you can say when it gets stuck in the debate, that's because we have, in the Senate, we have a gridlock, we can't do anything. And that's my problem with this system. Mechanically speaking, all of these are amazing levers, they all work really, really well, but the actual reality of how you, for example, outplay factions that you dislike is lost in the abstract sauce. Saying, for example, I'm gonna go with first past the post because I checked Tennessee and we are using wealth voting, and if I settle industries in Tennessee, I can flip that entire state. Sometimes you might say, wait a minute, Tennessee already agrees with me, but currently, you know, it's just the fact that, like, proportional representation isn't working out. Or, well, Tennessee agrees enough with me that I can just let them vote, except all of the people that agree with me are lost because of first past the post. Let's reform it to the Jefferson method. Where I'm coming from here is that these sort of shenanigans, where you really, really do the intense national gardening, isn't a thing in Victoria 3. Because the societal dialogue is captured insanely well within the interest group system, but the interest group system doesn't capture any country-unique sort of a political structure. They capture really, really well which are the active stakeholders of any society. They're customized as well. You know, in Japan you have the shogunate, in the US you have the southern landowners, and so on and so forth. In Prussia you have the Junkers. But the actual order of things, how things were done on a political level, how you could influence them by, for example, switching between first past the post and the Jefferson method, or whether you change your, you know, for example, upper house, whether you have an upper house, those things aren't in there because in Victoria 3, they are always implied, right? They are implied when you pass something. You can say my thing is bicameral, it's unicameral, it makes it so that, you know, it gets stuck X or there or whatever, right? I hope that where I'm coming from here, why I think, mechanically speaking, this is an excellent system, but immersion-wise, it doesn't pull me in at all in comparison to what I'm looking at here, for example. And again, terrible screen, but what I mean is, like, the notion of actually looking at Tennessee and saying, you know what, if we just move to the Jefferson method, that means my party in Tennessee, despite being in the minority, can get me more votes, and those votes will be enough to actually get my targets done, right? I can't do that in Victoria 3, and, like, you can't do it in Victoria 2 either, just for the record. Again, I'm not saying that here either. Victoria 2 is a great political system in which nothing works. Mechanically speaking, a disaster. But on an immersion level, I think, I wish that we got something there. Something there that goes beyond... let's see how political parties work out, but I doubt it, because, again, it doesn't approach the chambers of Parliament or of Congress to any meaningful way. And this isn't just a US thing, of course. I mean, Germany, the German Empire was a bicameral system, you know, it went around the proportional population distribution in the upper chamber and whatnot. You have very, very different assemblies in very different ways. I hope that it came across here what I mean when I make the distinction where I say this dev diary is excellent on the mechanical level, but on the immersion level, I can't say it's pulling me in. This, I think this is where, for me personally, definitely a rift has opened up. Let's continue. This was my expedition into this topic. Now, that is basically all. Please do keep it in mind. If you were to write a comment, I would appreciate it, of course, but also please do keep it in mind for the rest of the dev diary, because that applies to the entire thing. So, under the wealth voting law, political power is held by the pops and their interest groups, who can accumulate the most wealth and largely deny entirely to the destitute. This naturally favors aristocrats and the landowners in more agricultural economies, while favoring capitalists and the industrialists in more industrialized economies. This is what I mean when I say on a mechanical level, this is ingenious. You can be in wealth voting and have this sort of top-down relationship where the powerful, where the rich, where the, you know, basically the old money, right? Where they are in power and in control of things, and you don't need to change the law. Wealth voting will push you towards it either way. This is why I'm saying this is really, really good, ingenious even, when it comes to IGs and their laws to really emulate societies that could be as absolutist, as, you know, fairly, non-progressive as, for example, the Great Qing, or they could be like the German Empire. In both ways here, you will have an effect that is unique, because in the German Empire, this would mean that the industrialists dominate, much like they did historically, and in the Great Qing, it would mean, I mean, if they were to vote, that, of course, the aristocrats in a fairly rural, in a non-urban economy, would actually be dominating. It's the same law, it's a very different application, but the problem is that since the law works in a generalistic way, and then is differently distributed based on where your country is, you lose the fact that, you know, for example, the Reichstag and everything going on there, when the German states, well, the German member states of the German Empire get together in their own convenient assembly to basically be the upper chamber. None of that is emulated. You need to put that into context in your mind. And that is something, again, that is basically the additional application here, which is why I was saying keep this in mind for the rest of the dev diary. This is very visible here as well. Mechanically, it works amazingly. Immersion-wise, I'm not so certain for myself. Let's take a look at the effects here. Plus 150 authority, plus 40 political strength from votes. So if you can vote, you get much more political strength, meaning parliament would, be primarily made up because of you, but the interest groups, of course, benefit beyond parliament as well. Plus 20 wealth threshold for voting and plus 20 government legitimacy. This is quite nice. I like the government legitimacy that comes natively if you are, basically dissolving your autocracy and are moving more to democracy, because of course the core idea of democracy is that the government is legitimized because you voted for them. So the more you go towards universal suffrage and so I would expect that you get higher base legitimacy. This will also unlock women's suffrage, law in rights of women. I assume any and all laws that let you vote unlock this, because it's basically an option, right, where you can then enable it. And then down here we have disallowed by chiefdom in governance principles. That makes sense perfectly fine. This law is supported by one interest group. Wealthy citizens are granted a vote. Men of more wealth, there we are granted more votes. Quite interesting. All of these laws are compatible with any of the governance principle laws. A country with a monarchy law, for instance, could be an absolute monarchy with no voting system at all, or it could have universal suffrage. Likewise, a republic might very well be a presidential dictatorship. If you're so inclined, you could even create a council republic or theocracy that uses wealth voting, though it would be bound to create some political conflict, to put it lightly. You can experiment with this like crazy. As I said, on a mechanical level, and even on a gardening level here, I will admit, this is an outstanding system. I just really wish we went deeper into the legal frameworks, but maybe that is just with my background as well. Yeah, but fundamentally, this is such a flexible level system where you can employ it both in Great Qing, both in Brazil, both in the United States of America, in the German Empire, in the British, Republic, but, also in the Vatican. You can apply this and employ this wherever you want, because this system is really and truly universal. On a mechanical level, this stuff is gold. There are three factors that, when applicable, will prevent pops from voting entirely. Discrimination. Discriminated pops cannot vote in elections. Makes perfect sense. Living in an unincorporated state. Only pops living in incorporated states can participate in elections. Pops living in, for example, a growing colony cannot vote. I thought about this. I can't recall whether the German Empire, for example, I wouldn't know about, for example, the Italian colonies or the Spanish colonies or the French colonies. I know that the French, I believe, let you vote in literally just incorporated states, right? They restricted it to the what they consider to be part of metropolitan France. They still do it to this day. Of course, you got a bunch of islands that vote in the French elections. I'm not sure whether the German Empire basically said, as long as you have German citizenship, you can vote, but I don't think so, right? I believe it was based on where you actually lived and had German citizenship, meaning that in the colonies you surely couldn't vote, although don't quote me on this. Politically inactive pops do not vote regardless of whether they are legally eligible. That is not a surprise, I think. These pops are not part of any interest group and tend to have low literacy and or standard of living. Peasants working subsistence farms, for instance, are almost always politically inactive. Makes perfect sense. In 1913, suffragette Emily Davison was killed by the king's horse during a race. A passionate believer in her cause, she had been arrested repeatedly by the British government and force-fed while on hunger strikes. Right. This is now diving into the topic of women's suffrage, and I think that is a really, really interesting topic, because what they are showcasing here is basically how technology influences the political discourse changing. And I think this is an excellent example. I still have some questions about this, but we're going to see it, look at this in detail in a second. An activist seeking to bring attention to the cause of women's suffrage has died in an incident at a derby, killed by a racehorse belonging to William of Hanover. Some are truer warriors than others, but the perfect Amazon is she who will sacrifice all even unto the last to win the pearl of freedom for her sex. No one would have to die for this cause if these basic rights had been granted, or we won't extend political sympathy to such reckless behavior. These are, of course, the options that you have. Very, very cool event. Is inspired by history. I always love when they do that. And I think in this case, of course, it is important to note that this is triggered once you are in certain circumstances on a technological and political level. Let's take a look. This is a good opportunity to talk about the women's suffrage movement. In Victoria 3, passing the women's suffrage law will greatly increase both your workforce ratio and your dependent enfranchisement. This means that a greater proportion of your pops will be eligible to work in buildings, and a much greater proportion of dependents will now count towards the voting power of their pop. So this fundamentally, since you don't actually differentiate in a pop, like between women and men. It's more percentage based. It's based on how much of this pop can be politically active. What is the potential of this pop when it comes to political strength? What is the workforce and such? It approaches this on this very same level, right? So the ratio increases and the dependents are more enfranchised than they were before. That is basically what this law's impact would be, and that can be positive, that can be negative. But of course, to get there, there has to be a fight. Unless the powers that be, the established powers, were to just give up without a fight, and that is very, very unlikely at the end of the day. Right, there will be very little support among interest groups to pass this law in 1836, however. After researching feminism or having the technology spread to your country, politicians will begin to appear with a feminist ideology. Important to point out, politicians will appear. I was thinking about this as well. Once socialism is researched, how do you integrate socialism into the trade unions? How does it happen? What are the circumstances? Can I stop them from doing it by, for example, having trade unions in government, making it so that, you know, maybe, unless they, you know, are not integrated in my government, they might just say, we accept socialism. But if they are integrated, they might say, you know what, socialism now, we just need to be organized. I would be interested in knowing that right now. And in this diary, they are only talking about leaders getting the feminist ideology trait, which causes them to strongly approve of women's suffrage and disapprove of less egalitarian laws. This might be the same for socialist policies and such, right? So for socialist ideology. Whether this can become party inherent, I assume it can be, but I have so many questions here that go unanswered in this dev diary, sadly. Once you research political agitation, the suffrage movement will begin in full force. The Votes for Women journal entry will appear, and events will trigger from it that will give you the opportunity to grow or suppress the political movement. Think about this. This is very akin to being basically a generic American Civil War slavery issue journal. I like that. I think that's really good. You can make technology, which usually, especially even social technology, is rooted in this sort of very abstract relationship to you as the player, because you research this as if to, you know, oh, yes, feminism, and you know the meme, everybody's seen it, right? So, or I think that meme actually comes from terrorism. Yeah, we research terrorism, hell yeah, brother. I think this is a nice integration. It comes via personnel, so via the leaders, and then it advances through journals, and you can choose to support it, to go against it, you can crack down on terrorism. I would be really happy if, you know, for example, terrorism cells as they existed in Victoria 2, instead of just being annoying, if they actually opened up a bit of a journal and said, interact with me. You know, do something that will lead you down a different road. You could just let it happen, and maybe that will trigger a civil war. Maybe that will trigger you, you know, being all of a sudden a really harsh regime that you wanted to be in the first place. I hope that this is not just a one-off. I hope that many social theories and ideas are integrated in this women's suffrage way, because this is really, really neat. I like it. You can complete the journal entry by passing the law and having your first election campaign with women eligible to vote. Alternatively, you can ignore or suppress the movement till it loses its momentum and withers away. Why, you ask? Would you want to suppress the suffrage movement? If you're striving for an egalitarian society, you certainly wouldn't. However, if instead you're trying to preserve the aristocracy and maintain a conservative nation, then not only will your ruling interest groups strongly disapprove of women's suffrage, but it will also be very harmful to their political power. Greater dependent enfranchisement inherently benefits larger pops more than smaller pops, especially under more egalitarian laws like universal suffrage. Of course, more people get to vote, and fewer people are rich, meaning that these more people will likely be poor, likely not support your aristocrat IGs. And it is inevitable that there are vastly more laborer, machinists, and farmers than there ever will be aristocrats or capitalists. Pops may begin to wonder why the lower strata, the largest class, does not simply eat the other two. I like Futurama. Anyway, let's move on. This is the election campaign, and this is where things get really cool. I like this system, don't get me wrong here, right? The election campaigns that we had in Victoria 2, from the screen that I showed you earlier, I mean, I got it right here. Oh, I closed it actually. From the screen that I showed you earlier, I liked the legal framework, but as I said, mechanically speaking, I think that the actual election campaigns were super interesting as a concept and really mechanically poor. This is a better mechanical integration yet again. The Whigs took a catastrophic hit in the polls after I repeatedly fired a negative election event to test the system. You can see the polls right here, and they are really asserting themselves onto the total voter amount, which is interesting. I'm just so confused about, honestly, the numbers in this, man, the numbers in this, I have so many questions here, right? We can see, apparently, the total amount of people that can vote is 18.4 million. But then we see total voters are 7.54 million. I assume that 18.4 million means voting power in total. Yeah, the numbers, what do they mean? What do the numbers mean, Mason? The Tory party has a negative momentum, the Whig party has an even worse momentum, and you can see that the Tory party is popping off. That is also just the landed gentry. We have the industrialist intelligentsia, the armed forces, and the petite bourgeoisie in the Whig party, and they are losing because, again, negative events. Let's take a look how that actually works. Elections happen every 4 years in countries with voting laws. I wonder whether I can trigger elections deliberately. I don't know whether you knew this, but in countries such as... I think Canada got rid of it. I'm not sure actually whether they did. But the UK got rid of it. They now have a fixed terms law. I believe Australia still can do the same thing for Canada. The ruling Prime Minister can trigger an election whenever he wants. In the UK, Parliament now must agree to dissolve itself. I wonder whether we can call our own election. And even for that, I'm like, I would love a parliamentary procedural law, whether I can dissolve it, whether I can't dissolve it, whether the Prime Minister can dissolve it, whether I need an actual parliamentary majority. Seriously, that's what I mean. You dissolving it in your headcanon, you can say the Prime Minister dissolved it, but that is an abstraction that shouldn't have to be there. I would love the immersion of actually having that law, of actually having to say that is our political tradition and that is the way it is, right? Rather than headcanoning it. An election campaign begins 6 months prior to a country's election date. Each political party is assigned a momentum value at the beginning of the campaign, which is a measure of the success of their campaign and is a major factor in determining how many votes they will garner on election day. Since parties, leaders, and many other aspects of the political scene in your country are likely to have changed in the years since the previous election, the momentum from previous elections does not carry over and is reset. I really wonder what your starting momentum is, like how that is determined per party. Could it be that parties like in Stellaris have certain goals, and if they can't pass them, then their momentum is lower, if they pass them it's higher, or vice versa? Maybe it's related to a radicalism of the pop supporting a party. I, again, as I said, have so many questions about the numbers here, and there are no answers to be found in this dev diary. Momentum can be affected by chance, events, and the popularity of interest group leaders. Of course, that makes sense, but what the actual starting value is, it's a big question for me. Whether there are legislative targets, you know, for these parties, I have also no idea. How do parties, do they fall apart? Do they only stand together for an election? Do they reassemble between every election? That is, of course, for next week, but even beyond that, so many questions that are sadly not answered. Similar to this as well. I tried to understand this for such a long time, and I'm not sure. The Tory success in the last election empowered the landed gentry, though the sheer wealth of their aristocratic supporters is still the largest contributor to their political strength under Great Britain's wealth voting law. The clout of the landed gentry is 10.6%. The political strength in raw numbers is 6.53 million. The base from the population is 94k. Political strength of votes in an election that they gained in the last election, basically, right, is plus 973k, but then you can see there's a colon here. From wealth. Does that mean, is from wealth its individual modifier? Is from wealth because of when the election was held, we had wealth laws? If I change the law, does the from wealth modifier instantly disappear, or is it tied to the political strength of votes in an election? Why does it say this number and then it announces from wealth as well? Do these numbers influence one another? I have no idea. I would assume that these numbers, this right here, is static until an election is held that changes these numbers, whether that is because you changed the law or just because the clouds and the momentum turned out differently. I don't know. A big question for me as well is if I have a scandal, that sort of stuff, right? Technically, the parliamentary makeup remains the same. Obviously, you can have people crossing the aisles and whatnot, but it is very fluid to change interest groups, or it should be, within autocracies, because I can say as a dictator, hey, or as the king, hey, I'm no longer listening to the armed forces, I'm listening to the intellectuals, right? That is how you could change the IG influences there. In a democracy, even though parliament isn't simulated to this degree here, you still have an implied parliament, and parliament doesn't just radically shift from 50% armed forces to 5% armed forces, right? I don't know whether basically the clout in a democracy is always the same. when it comes to these numbers, or whether there can be like shift overs of people in parliament. But it's technically not really true even, because like this is like all based on population rather than parliament seats. Since they don't actually calculate parliament seats, oh man, I am missing parliament as an institution. That's really what it boils down to. Even in this calculation, I'm like, you can't really nail this down, because you can't just say 5 senators left our side and moved on to the secessionist side. You can't say that, because it's all via IGs, and the IGs only have parliament implied. Parliament doesn't actually de facto exist. I like the mechanic. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's so important for me to point this out. I like the mechanics so much. I think the way the calculation works here, you know, in its principle, seems really, really logical. But then I think about this and I'm like, it's so abstract. You know, it's like when a party scandal were to happen, let's say it can, right? You would be taking away, let's say, 500,000 from this value, rather than 10 members of the House of Representatives, right? And that's just, it feels so odd. It feels so abstract. You have to interpret how many representatives that is, what it means. You have to interpret when you know, have this debate that this technically is, it means it gets stuck in the Senate and such. It feels so unsatisfying on an immersion level. Honestly, I think this is probably the most negative I've been on a dev diary in a long time. I just can't, I can't find peace. I can't find God on this issue. When the election campaign ends, the votes are in and the results are set in place until the next election. This is why I'm saying I think this remains stable the way it is until the next election comes along, even if you were to change laws. These modifiers obviously could still change it. I assume the base from population could still change it, because that is, I assume, the active participants in the IG. It's a weird one. Interest groups receive additional political strength from their party's votes, which will be a major factor determining your legitimacy and therefore the effectiveness of your government. The actual makeup of your government is still up to you. Just like the electoral system of most modern countries, winning the popular vote does not automatically mean that a certain party or coalition of parties gets to form a government. But the post-election strength of your interest group and their party affiliations should be a major consideration, especially if you're forming a minority government. In Victoria 3, elections can be a powerful force for political change, but also a source of volatility. Dealing with, and if you're so inclined, manipulating election results will be a major consideration when you form your governments. Yeah, no, my conclusion is, on a generalistic political system level, this is mechanically outstanding. It's just that when we talk about manipulating results, when we talk about how the popular vote doesn't actually get you into government necessarily, we would have to include all of the topics, be that gerrymandering, be that, for example, first past the post, be that the 5% hurdle in Germany, be that whatever it might be, right? And those are merely implied in this great generalist system. Yeah, I'm very excited, because I think this means that we can genuinely have one of the most reliable and transparent and influential political systems within a grand strategy game. But I am inconsolable, it turns out, over the fact that the simulation of the parliamentary body is missing, and I don't think will be added via parties. Parties don't seem to be that. Let me know what you think. I'll see you later. Alligator.